Today's guest speaker is Avivah Wittenberg-Cox. Avivah was named in ELLE Magazine as one of the top 40 women leading change. She is the CEO of 21st, a TEDx speaker, writer for Forbes and Harvard Business Review, and an author of a number of best-selling nonfiction books. Welcome, Avivah, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Heather. Lovely to be here with you.
So I've read a number of your articles in Forbes, particularly. You're a very talented writer, have a lot of important things to share with people. One of the terms you use in your work is longevity. And my question to you is, would you say that that term longevity is analogous to sustainability? And why do you think it's important?
No, and I probably argue that many people would think it's actually a contradiction in terms. So longevity is about humans living longer than they ever have before. So in the last 100 years, we've doubled life expectancy. And so the language around that is a longevity economy. There are impacts in the world about this longevity phenomenon of humans, and many people might argue that it's not particularly sustainable to have humans lying around the planet for ever extending lifespans. I like to think that maybe older humans will help us figure out how to be more sustainable as we live. So that one might be one way those words are more optimistically correlated. But I think right now, if we're talking about sustainability issues of the planet and overpopulation and things like that, longevity was probably still be seen as a threat as opposed to an opportunity.
Okay, and why do you think it's important to look at longevity as an issue?
Well, I think for all kinds of reasons. One, I think the trend is clear. I think we will be living longer. We're already living, we've already been gifted by science over the last 100 years, an extra 3 decades. I'm just reading a book by a Harvard professor that says we'll easily, in not too long a time, be able to live probably significantly longer, 120, 130. And I think what's interesting about that, and a lot of the work I do, is people aren't even really internalizing or adapting to the fact of 100-year life, let alone 120, 130-year long life. So I think we need to learn how to pace our lives quite differently, how to prepare financially, physically, intellectually for much longer careers than we've been used to. I mean, we kind of think of a 30 or 40-year career. What if we start having 50, 60, or 70-year careers? How do we stay relevant? How do we keep learning? We've been talking about lifelong learning for a long, long time. Now the vocabulary is shifting to long life learning. So how are you going to keep up to date over vast expanses of time? And one shot in your 20s isn't going to be enough. So I personally, as you might know, I'm going back to school now as I have just turned 60, because I think it's time to start updating and preparing for what might be another 30 or 40-year haul, right?
Well, Avivah, you're definitely relevant. So you have no challenges in that arena. Good for you.
Thank you, Heather. I'll take that.
Yes, receive it. And also good for you for going back to school and learning. And I'm going to do a plug with the mindfulness meditation piece here and around sustainability. With the mindfulness, the intention is to be more sustainable in the way we live, and to look at time in a different way and how we're experiencing life in a different way, so that we can be sustainable over the long term. And I will say that the mindfulness meditation increases youth hormones. The GH and the DHEA and GABA, those are youth hormones. So it enhances our ability to even look better and to feel better. Yeah. All right. So
a regular meditator, so I will certainly plug in with you on the sustainability. And I think absolutely, I think a lot about what I call the 4 quarters of a 100-year life. So every 25 years, each of those quarters has a developmental role and purpose and its own pacing and timing. But I think it's quite interesting to be able to be more mindful about even the existence of those quarters. And I think what's really new with the extension of life is what I call the 3rd quarter, the 50 to 75 piece, where we will likely be healthier, much more active for a longer period of time and still working. And then I think, how do we plan for that and realize that when we're in our 2nd quarter, which is 25 to 50, which most people think is adulthood, we're really only in the first half of adulthood. And I think that shifts a lot of ideas and opportunities of when you might want to mindfully choose how to do things and how much time to give them, whether it's personal things like parenting, education, or whether it's creating new businesses, giving back, purpose. We're going to have many, many more decades to do things in the future. So this long debate we've all had on having it all, I think we will, particularly women, be able to have it all across a 100-year lifespan, which might not have been so much the case before.
No, yeah, that's very interesting. And I'm thinking too, like the 3rd quarter, I'm using your language here, those 3rd quarter people, shifting the perspective that the life will go longer, and then what legacy is going to be left behind, right? Like, what is our ultimate impact on those we leave behind? And that's a really important,
and the planet,
yeah,
the people and the planet,
people on the planet, right, and economics. Like, I think those things can be interrelated. They are interrelated, and how do we balance them and make them work to support each other? So yes, with you on that. Now, another thing
you would like what I call my 4 W's.
Well, you have
a bit of a side tangent, but I have like 4. I'm always in 4. I don't know why. 4 quarters, 4. But my 4 W's is the huge shift that all of our big corporate clients are moving through at this time in history. It's web, weather, world, and women. So it's technological change, sustainability, climate issues, globalization and its backlashes, and the rise of women and the massive arrival of gender balance into labor forces, talent pools, consumer bases, and the shift that brings about.
Leadership. Okay. Okay. Another thing that you talk about is the need for companies to pay attention to the Gen X population and their focus on social responsibility. Can you say more about how this is relevant to organizations?
Well, I'd say what's interesting about organizations and generations is that we are now in a 5-generation workforce, which we haven't really seen before. So we're going from, boomers all the way down to what will soon be replacing Gen Z. And each of these generations, I don't want to make stereotype. There's a lot of stereotyping going around about what different generations want. But I think there's a growing understanding among all generations, but particularly the young, of the need for really proactive climate crisis rescue. And I think that's increasing with every generation that comes along. And I think what's interesting is I think a lot of older generations are now in that bandwagon too, right? So I don't think there's much of a generational divide on sustainability issues, but I think what the corporate world is not yet waking up to is how to manage this 5-generation piece, where many of them want, in your parlance, a more sustainable kind of personal, professional balance, and they want a lot more flexibility. And so I summarize it as, for the first time, we're seeing the interests of the millennials, the perennials, and the parents, so all generations combined, who are really prioritizing flexibility. And we've seen it all the way through this pandemic. We're seeing it in the return on the debates of this kind of artificial debate about work from home, which is largely incomprehensible, but where I'm hearing there's a kind of 1% of the executive suite that wants people back at work, and nobody else wants to go full-time back into the past. They're all fighting to get into a much more hybrid future, not just of hybrid cars, but hybrid workplaces too. So I think that's coming. I can't quite understand the degree of resistance. In my experience, it's coming mostly from old men with wives at home that don't work. And I don't know why it is that, as I read one very interesting article that said, we lose all status online. And so the tiles on a Zoom call aren't any bigger if you're up at the top or down at the bottom, which might be one of the explanations why some of these senior leaders are really driving a return full time to the office, because they are very lonely in that particular push.
In their office at home, they're feeling lonely with the pets and the children and the wife, whatever. Yeah, and I would say too that people tend to be very resistant to change. That's another thing we talk about with the mindful leadership is adapting and listening to change, what's going on around you. And it's like an adapt or die situation, particularly if you think about the private sector, needing that flexibility and that, ability to shift. And, people get attached to the inertia and what's comfortable for them and so forth. But yeah.
And so one of my questions on that is it's often linked to age. And I would actually argue that that's not true. I think there are people who love change, personality-wise, philosophically, intellectually, who always have and always will all their lives. And there are other people who prefer and have a personality profile that is more geared to security. This is how we get, political labels like conservative or progressive, right? And so I think it's not really an age issue. And I think it would be really interesting to harness some of the energies for change and progressiveness of the young with the appetite, knowledge, and experience of change of the old.
Yeah, so valuing the differences of the generations and creating something bigger, right, by combining the strengths of the various.
And the appetite for change that is cross-generational,
yeah,
especially on issues like sustainability now.
Right, and the mindfulness meditation is also there to help people cope and adapt to change and thrive in change. So that's just another tool to help people, regardless of generation. It's there as a tool. So, okay, and then if you were to leave one key message or tip for the leaders watching this about how to create a more balanced work structure, what would that be?
I would say integrate the 4 quarters into everything you do, in recognizing that people's lives and careers will increasingly be over a much longer time span, and they will need different rhythms and pacing. The old unbroken up or out linear career has been obsolete for a long time, but companies have been very, very slow to shelve it and invent much more organic forms for a very new workforce.
Okay, repeat the 4 quarters again to refresh people's minds.
So the 4 quarters of the now kind of expected 100-year life would be every 25 years, right? From 0, 25, 50, 75, and 100. If we imagine that we're going to be working on the whole from 25 to 75, that's a 50-year time span. And it is kind of a first, if the second quarter, 25 to 50 is like the first half of adulthood, but 50 to 75 is the new piece, which is the second half of adulthood. And Peter Drucker announced this, 20 years ago, saying there would be 2 very different workforces, those over 50 and under 50, and they'd have very different needs, pacings, and motivations. And I think almost no companies I know are yet thinking about that kind of generational balance and what it might imply for their own, not only labor forces and talent pools, but also for their customer bases. Where the assets and the money lie is not usually in the first part of life, it's in the second.
Very nice. Thank you. All right, Avivah, how can people connect with you, learn more about your work?
On my various websites, so 20-first.com, or a more complicated one to spell, avivahwittenberg-cox.com. I'll be there and very receptive. Also on LinkedIn, of course.
And all of your social media buttons are on your websites, correct? So they can just click on that to connect with you. That might be easy for people. Okay,
and I'll be in Boston for all of 2022 if anybody's passing through.
Oh, you will be. Excellent. I'm on the East Coast too. Maybe I can find my way up there to meet you. Yes, Avivah's joining us from England, so this is a big treat to have her here. Thank you so much for sharing all of your wisdom. You have excellent mental clarity, looking at things at a 6,000 square foot view. So very, very interesting and valuable. All right, Avivah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Heather, for a mindful Monday conversation. Until next time.
Yes.